Used to be addiction of drugs was considered sort of moral failing. But now, with a much better understanding of how the human brain works, scientists found new clues about the vicious cycle of desire, binging, and withdrawal that traps millions of people. Our brains evolved the reward system based on a chemical called dopamine. This dopamine creates craving in us to encourage behavior that help us survive, such as eating, sexual needs, interacting socially.
In turn, pleasure is then stimulated by other neurotransmitters in hedonic hotspots of the brain. When dopamine's craving circuitry overwhelms the pleasure hotspots, addiction occurs. Essentially, your reward system is hijacked. Let's break it down this way. Your desires are triggered when dopamine, starting at the top of the brainstem, travels through neural pathways to affect the brain.
We know that drugs can increase the level of dopamine, and then the dopamine flows through dorsal striatum, where neurons will work to form some type of habits. For example, the pleasurable habits that people usually done, like buying drugs or simply buying a cigarette. With the help of glutamate, dopamine can also flow through prefrontal cortex.
Several drugs of abuse are also stimulants of dopamine release in the brain, particularly in the areas such as nucleus accumbens and prefrontal cortex. Then there's amygdala, where the dopamine causes neurons here to be stimulated by learned emotional responses, like rich leisure coated memories. So, what happens when the drugs artificially flood these pathways with dopamine? The rush can rewire your brain to want more drugs and thus create addiction.
It turned out that different drugs have different interaction with the reward system. Cocaine, for example, it blocks dopamine transports and prevents removal of excess dopamine from synapses. Methamphetamine, on the other hand, flood the terminal button and displacing the dopamine into synapses instead. And heroin blocked dopamine inhibitor, causing synapse to flood with dopamine without restraint. The good news: with the refined understanding of the devastating effects of this drug, we discovered new approaches to the treatment of addiction that have shown remarkable promise. Cocaine addicts have been able to shut off their cravings abruptly when electromagnetic pulses are applied to their prefrontal cortex. A drug hitherto used to treat muscle spasms called baclofen has shown promise for treating alcohol dependence, as more and more of our